All right, I might kick off. Welcome you, everybody, again. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today in all different parts of Queensland. Where I am is land of the Yuggera people on the south side of the Brisbane River. And I acknowledge their ancestors, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that it was Aboriginal land always and always will be. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. The subject of our discussion tonight is extreme weather and your rights in relation to extreme weather, particularly your industrial rights from employment law. That's what I'll talk about. And then James Gilbert, our health and safety manager, will go on to talk about the health and safety law that's relevant to extreme weather.
Okay, Kev, I'll share the screen for everyone, hey?
Yep. Thanks, James. Obviously, we're about to head into summer, where we tend to get more of our extreme weather with storms, floods, cyclones, especially up north, and occasionally bushfires as well.
Hang on, sorry.
So I'll talk about in terms of your industrial rights connected to extreme weather. I'll talk about them in two major for our two major groups of members. That is those who are working for Queensland Health, and then those working for every other employer in the private sector, private hospitals, aged care, and what we call our diverse sector, including general medical practices and all sorts of other settings where our members work. So first of all, actually, James, do you want to do the overview of the presentation? Yeah.
So the second component, I'll go through the health and safety component. So we'll talk about your duties as a worker under the Act, the sections that relate to a worker's right to cease work, your employer's obligations, and how they control risks. So with this sort of topic, it's a bit more nuanced, but that legislative regime still applies. So we'll go through that. Anyway, I'll let Kev take over, and there you go.
All right, thanks, James. So the question, first of all, of course, is, well, what is extreme weather? What are natural disasters? I think we all know they include things like, in terms of disasters, bushfires, cyclones, severe storms, floods, heat waves, and storm surges. And then extreme weather, of course, includes rainfall, high rainfall, or different kinds of rainfall, temperature extremes. Usually in Queensland, it's only heat. We don't tend, occasionally perhaps in Stanthorpe or something, may get a extreme of cold temperature. And wind, of course, high winds can also be very damaging and scary and causing injury as well. So I might move on to talk about, as I said, two sections or two groups of rights. I'll talk about those firstly for Queensland Health members, and then I'll move on and talk about our other members outside Queensland Health. If you're unable to attend your workplace, if you work in Queensland Health and you're unable to attend your workplace because of extreme weather, and you cannot work remotely, for example, work from home, you may be eligible to access special leave on full pay under a couple of different instruments or policies, which are fairly similar. One is the Queensland Health Special Leave Policy, C7. There's a link, web link to that policy in this PowerPoint. And as I said, a fairly similar type of instrument called the Special Leave Public Service Commission Directive number 5 of 2017. Under both of those policies or instruments, you may be able to get up to 5 days per year of paid leave. you can get more than that if the CEO approves in a variety of circumstances relating to floods, cyclones, bushfires, etc. If you can, if you're able to attend another government office, Queensland Health might direct you to go and work there. And I guess that could be not just another Queensland Health workplace, it might be a police station or a fire station or a primary industries office or a school even. So that might be your manager's first preference to get you to go to another government office. It's probably not used that commonly, because when there's an emergency on, your manager's probably not going to want to be trying to talk to managers in other nearby government offices to arrange for you to attend there. But anyway, it is potentially an option. But essentially, it's if you're unable to go to work because of the extreme weather, or if you can't leave your house to get to work because of extreme weather, then that special leave on full pay is possible. If you're in a situation where you've been directed to assist in an emergency, you may be eligible for more than 5 days of paid leave, because that is for leave on, or the amount of leave there is leave on full salary as required. So however long you're required to assist with that declared emergency or disaster, you may be eligible for that amount of leave. Most of the entitlements, I should say, most of the industrial entitlements concerning extreme weather are of the leave variety, essentially being granted leave not to do your normal work where that's not possible because of the extreme weather. Can we flip over to the next screen, please, James? The new EB11 also has a special clause about disaster relief, which goes beyond leave. It's clause 51 of Queensland Health's new EB11. And it applies in circumstances where the health service chief executive or their delegate determines that it's necessary for you to respond to a disaster or a potential disaster or an impending disaster that might overwhelm resources of Queensland Health. In that case, employees would be provided with meals and water. Obviously, this is in a situation where you're required to be in a hospital or your normal workplace. You'd be provided with meals and water where it is possible and reasonable to do so, when you're unable to leave the facility and therefore unable to provide your own meals. And if you're required to remain at the facility for long periods of time and where it's reasonable and necessary, the employee will be provided with rest space, accommodation, and amenities, such as toilets and showers and those sorts of things. There's also another reference there to the special leave on full pay that I mentioned earlier. That clause in the EB11 provides that time off in lieu is not appropriate for any overtime that you might work. So it should be cash payment for any overtime you're working in those circumstances of a public health emergency or another disaster that's been declared. There's other provisions of that clause deal with nurses grade 10 and above. Do we have any nurses grade 10 or above online? I would think not, but so I won't go into that. So that's essentially a very quick outline of the rights for members working for Queensland Health with respect to extreme weather. Can we move on to the next slide, please, James? And And now we'll move into the rights of members who work for employers who are not Queensland Health. As I said, private hospitals, aged care, that sort of thing. There are some enterprise agreements, EAs, which provide for natural disaster leave, but those few enterprise agreements that provide for that in aged care usually only allow between 1 and 3 days per year, even if a natural disaster prevents you from working for more than 1 to 3 days. So that's unfortunate, and we usually seek more than that, or an increase of that entitlement under bargain, but employers are usually reluctant to agree to that. The other source of rights about payment of wages during unusual periods of extreme weather is your employment contract. And this actually also applies to Queensland Health members. I'm not sure if all Queensland Health members have exactly the same terms in their contracts, or if there's a template contract used. I assume there probably is, but it probably varies over time. So our Queensland Health members may be on a whole variety of different types of contracts. But for all of our members, private and public, your employment contract is could be an important source of rights to be paid wages when you're prevented from working because of extreme weather. If you're lucky enough, or you've been smart enough to negotiate a contract which includes a payment of wages essentially for every week or every fortnight from beginning to end of that contract, in other words, from the commencement of your employment until the termination of your employment, well, then that's your wages are not dependent upon you providing service to your employer or doing any work. And in that case, if you can't work because of extreme weather, then you most certainly be entitled to be paid under your contract. But most of you probably don't have a contract like that. You might have a more standard kind of employment contract where your entitlement to wages probably depends on you rendering service to your employer. Rendering service essentially means you're doing what the employer tells you to do. So if your employer tells you to stay home during a period of extreme weather, then that is probably service to your employer, and that service probably earns you wages. A lot of employers don't understand this common law stuff about contracts. If it's not in a policy or an enterprise agreement, they find it hard to believe, but that is the case with contracts of employment. So it's if it's unclear to you whether you might be paid if you're required to stay home, it's a good idea, I think, to ask your employer, okay, there's some extreme weather around. It's not safe for me to leave the house, or it's not safe for me to go into the workplace, my normal workplace. What should I do? And if your employer, that is your manager, whoever the employer representative is, says that you should stay home, well, then when you're staying home, you're doing what you've been told by your employer. You're probably rendering service to the employer. You're probably entitled to wages for that time that you spend at home in accordance with your employer's instruction. The Fair Work Act is the main piece of industrial legislation that applies to, in fact, to all of our private sector members, in fact, to every employee in Australia, except for those who are employed by state governments, such as those in Queensland Health. Unfortunately, the Fair Work Act doesn't provide any form of paid leave for extreme weather or disasters. But of course, there are other forms of leave that you can take or request if the relevant circumstances apply during extreme weather. So if you're sick during extreme weather, of course, you can take personal leave. If you don't think you've got another source of entitlement to be paid when you're not working during extreme weather, then you could request, of course, annual leave, long service leave, accrued days off, or time off in lieu, etc. I guess that's a last resort. None of those forms of leave that I just mentioned were created for the purpose of getting you through extreme weather. They're created for recreational purposes or other reasons, not to do with extreme weather. So using those forms of leave is probably a last resort. There is a right under the Fair Work Act if you're engaged in an eligible community service activity, such as a voluntary emergency management activity, such as you're volunteering for the SES, or you're a volunteer firefighter or something like that. The Fair Work Act gives you a right to be absent from work, but unfortunately not a right to be paid. As I say, you might have to then fall back to your contract of employment, or hopefully your enterprise agreement provides some right to be paid in that circumstance. Something else from the Fair Work Act that may be relevant in an extreme weather situation is the provisions of the Act for an employer to stand down employees under Section 524. That section of the Fair Work Act allows an employer to stand down without pay any employee who cannot usefully be employed because of a stoppage of work for any cause for which the employer cannot be held responsible. So, of course, the employer cannot be held responsible for extreme weather, but there must also be a stoppage of work. That is, the employer there must be the entire workforce or a big chunk of it who stops work because of that extreme weather. If that's not the case, then it certainly is not the case that the employer can individually select workers to be stood down without pay because of extreme weather. There has to be a general stoppage of work. There is provision in the Fair Work Act for enterprise agreements to provide better rights than that. With respect to stand downs, that is, an enterprise agreement could provide that stand downs are to be with pay, and they could also provide a obligation on the employer to consult workers about the stand down, or to provide some notice, a week or two's notice or something of a stand down. But there are very few or perhaps no nursing or midwifery enterprise agreements that in the private sector which contain rights for members in that respect, unfortunately. Can we go to the next screen, please, James?
It's your question time, Kev.
Yeah. All right. So I've covered a fair bit there in a few minutes, more than a few. Does anyone have any questions about what I said before we move on to James's presentation? Don't be shy. If I was speaking too quickly and you need me to repeat something, I'm happy to do that.
Right. All right. Well, I might move on to my bit. If you do think of a question, you can put it in the chat, and Kevin can answer then. So my section is going to be more around, natural disasters and extreme weather and how that impacts on your health and safety rights. So I'm going to break it into three bits. I'll talk about what the Act says. So the Act in Queensland is the Work Health and Safety Act 2011, and it provides information in terms of how an employer has to manage things. There are also components in that Act that talks about workers' responsibilities, so I'll go through that. I'll talk about what should happen should you find yourself in a situation where you're impacted by an event like this, and what you can do if there's a problem. So I'll try and hopefully by the end of it I'll have provided with enough information that you feel comfortable with that sort of thing. All right. So Section 28, I'm sorry it's a bit dry, but I think it's really important that people know what their responsibilities are. So when something says duties in an act, it's what's required of you. So you are a worker as defined under the Act. You know, if you're employed in healthcare, you're captured. So while this it sort of tells you what you have to do, it also assists you when you need to make determinations. Mainly the last couple of years, we've had a few conversations with members who have had difficulty getting to work because of flooding, or there has been a severe storm or a hailstorm. So they've wondered what responsibility they have. So if you look at Part A, it says you have to take reasonable care for your own health and safety. Now, whilst travelling to and from work is not explicitly stated in the Work Health and Safety Act, there is, as Kevin mentioned before, you do have common law rights, and it is generally accepted that travelling to or from work, if there is a reasonable expectation that your employer needs to think about that component. They can't just say that's got nothing to do with us. They clearly do. So you also have to comply with any reasonable instruction from your employer. So it's really important that people look at it and says, when you see the word reasonable, what that means. So we'll keep that in the back of our mind, and I'll move on to the next slide. And so this is the section of the Act that provides the capacity for a worker to cease unsafe work if they believe that they are at serious risk of injury from an imminent, and this is really important, you need to think about it, needs the exposure that you have needs to be immediate or imminent. Okay, so it can't be, I don't know what's a good, it has to be a reasonable perception. So it's got that word reasonable in that section again. And what reasonable is they base it on the reasonable person test, what a reasonable person would do in the circumstance. So we've got that in our background. The other important thing about that is there's a couple more sections. There's section 86 that goes with section 84, is that if you choose to invoke this right, you have an obligation to advise your employer and remain available for work elsewhere. So that sort of sits comfortably with what Kevin has said, in terms of particularly Queensland Health being able to say, well, we want you to come and work here. If you can't get to that work site, we suggest that you can work here. Okay, so what are your employer's obligations? So your employer has to, when you see a person conducting a business or undertaking in the Work Health and Safety Act, that means employer. The reason they use that term is to capture things mainly in some industries, such as the building industry, where you have subcontracting and things like that. So the person conducting the business or undertaking, what it effectively stops is the person who is in overall, control of the workplace saying, well, they're subcontractors, they're not my problem. They can't do that by using this term. Sorry, my dog is barking. So they have to, so far as reasonably practicable, ensure your safety. Now, the term reasonably practical, it doesn't mean they don't have to do much or anything. There is a specific section that talks about what is reasonably practicable, and quite often people will say, well, it's going to cost a lot. Well, it's important that people are aware in the definition of what's reasonably practicable. They can't just say that. It has I think that the section talks about the cost of doing something has to be grossly disproportionate to the risk. So, you know, it's quite strong, so we don't need to worry about that. The section goes on to talk about some of the types of things that they might have to do. So they have to provide a safe work environment. So, you know, typically a safe work environment might be the building. It might be, you know, that the floors are, you know, not slippery and all that sort of stuff. So that's what the work environment refers to. The second is they have to have safe systems of work. So because you're a shift worker, you're driving at night. So that's another impact. If you are being expected to turn up to a night shift and there's a severe storm or there's flooding, that must be considered in the calculation as to whether or not it's safe for you to attend the workplace. It also talks about adequate facilities. So that enhances the component Kevin was talking about in terms of the new EB11 clause providing food and, you know, clothing and all sorts of stuff. The other thing they have to do is provide information, training, instruction or supervision. So this is really important in terms of they have an obligation to tell you what's going on in a circumstance where you have a extreme weather event, and they're trying to ensure that you can come to work. So in the Act, our Act is based on a system of risk management. So you won't find anything prescriptive in the Act. And a perfect example of that is people will often say to us, if I'm working outside or if I'm doing, you know, community care, at what temperature am I allowed to say, oh, I'm not going to work? You will not find anything like that. It won't say something like if it turns 37 degrees, you stop work. There's nothing like that in the Work Health and Safety Act. Everything has to be considered in terms of a risk matrix. You know, quite often I've put there, you know, a little bit of a provocative statement, but people say to us, well, I need to go to work. It's my responsibility because my employer can't control the weather and getting to work is my responsibility. Well, it is, but there are shared responsibilities. It can't just be left on the worker in terms of making a determination of getting to work or what's safe when they do get to work. Okay, so these are the type of things that your employer is required to consider. And my suggestion is that they should be considering these right now. They should have policies and procedures around these sorts of things, because you can't say that the last couple of years, you know, what did we start off? We started off with fires in 2019. And then since that time, it's been a succession of floods throughout the state, and, you know, the poor people down in the southern states are still experiencing that. So there's a high likelihood that this is not going to go away, and we're going to have these sort of issues all the time. They have to think about, can the workplace be accessed, safely accessed rather? So they have a responsibility. There are sections in the Work Health and Safety Regulation, which is a bit of legislative, it's a legislative component that sits underneath the Act that tells an employer what they have to do. So whilst it doesn't talk about you getting to work safely, it does talk about an employer's responsibility to ensure entry and egress to the workplace is safe. So, you know, that's why they have a responsibility in terms of making sure that people can get into work. They need to think about, in terms of your workplace, what might have occurred after a serious event. So earlier this year, I went up to Kingaroy Hospital, and those guys were telling me about a weather event they experienced up there in the new hospital that just flooded. So in that circumstance, the employer needs to think about, okay, well, we've had this issue, we now have to consider these further things. So I'm not sure what contingency they had, but it was sometimes after. But they had a whole section of the hospital that was cordoned off, and you couldn't go into it. So that's a responsibility. They also have. They need to keep you up to date, or ensure that workers are up to date about weather conditions, because if you're working in Ingham or somewhere up there, you're regularly exposed to cyclones, and this season it's likely to be a few. Apparently, they need to talk about or have something in place. How can we ensure that our workers know how things are progressing? It shouldn't be just all a rush at one point in time, and they have to make a determination. When is it safe for people they need to stay at home rather than come into workplace? And indeed, that also affects, okay, well, that component Kevin was talking about, if we need you to stay in the workplace, so there has to be a point where they make that decision. They also just can't send you off somewhere without, training you in terms of some capacity. So if they say, okay, well, I'm going to use North Queensland again. You're employed in Gordon Vale, but we want you to work at Cairns base because you live in Cairns and, Gordon Vale's out of town. They can't just lump you in there. They need to give you, it's probably pretty similar to being sent to another ward in terms of, you had excess staff, which never happens anymore, on one particular ward, and they're asking you to go to another one. They need to think about, well, can you travelling, is there a requirement that you travel at a particular time? Can you come in early and they pay you, or let you go home early, or something like that? And the other thing they need to consider, and it's really important now, is because there is a new code of practice for in Queensland in terms of their responsibilities in managing psychosocial risks. So there's extra emphasis on the employer in terms of ensuring that, some of these things can be pretty traumatic, and, your employer needs to consider that in terms of ensuring your health and safety. Okay, what should you do? So if you're at home and half your house is blown away, you need to let your employer know. You need to follow emergency services advice. So if there are flood alerts in your area, say you shouldn't cross this particular road, or you follow that advice, but you let your employer know. You need to find out if your employer has any policies around these sorts of things, and you need to, if they don't, have a bit of a discussion in terms of they need to develop some. I suspect there are, but I bet you that none of you guys have been consulted in terms of what they mean or what should occur. And that is a specific obligation under the Work Health and Safety Act. And finally, don't cross any roads just because you need to get to work. I understand the ethos people have in terms of the health field, in terms of their obligations and duty of care to get to work and assist people, but you have a common law right to say, no, I can't come into work at this point in time. You are obliged to tell your employer. Now, Kevin was talking about extreme heat and cold. I thought I would talk about this because during COVID, we had circumstances where the usual workplace people were in, where you're able to manage sort of temperature issues, was sort of tested in that it had so many outdoor COVID clinics. So there was a whole myriad of work done in relation to that. So your employer is obliged to manage that. And I thought that was pertinent in terms of we don't know what COVID holds for us. So I thought I would chuck that in. And there's a whole code of practice on the work environment, and there are specific obligations under extremes of heat and cold. There's a whole lot of detail in that document that talks about, you know, ventilation, it talks about water, it talks about all those sorts of things. So whilst they don't immediately come to mind for somebody who might work in a big hospital, they certainly, you know, who would have envisaged we'd been having people standing out on tarmacs, swabbing people. So, you know, I just thought I would throw that in. And I just want to reiterate your employer's obligation to talk to you about any proposals that they might have in terms of policies. They are obliged. The Act requires them to talk to you about issues related to work and health and safety. So, you know, go in there, have a discussion with your employer, and or check to see if they've got any policies. And you know, if you're not comfortable with the policies, you can raise that through your health and safety consultative arrangements, whether you've got a HSR or whether you've got a health and safety committee. That's the person to raise it with. And if you still have issues, then you certainly come to us and we'll see what we can do in terms of assistance. And that's it for me. So that was pretty quick. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them as best I can. And I hope that's been useful for people.
James, maybe you can stop screen sharing and so we can see your wonderful face.
Thank you. There we go.
Fabulous. There is one question
Sure.
From Fiona in the chat, which says, if the next shift can't come in due to flooding of roads, the staff on duty are expected to stay. What is reasonable in this case? Okay, so that's a two thing. So first of all, it's your industrial responsibilities, and Kevin might be able to talk about that. But the other thing that your employer needs to think about is then if you are doing additional work, then they need to consider, okay, well, let's create another risk in terms of a fatigue risk, and they have to have mechanisms and controls to deal with that. I suspect Kevin's going to tell you that there are circumstances where they can ask you to stay, but I will let him probably answer that one.
Thanks, James. I guess in that situation, the people being asked to stay back are probably working additional hours beyond what they've been rostered for, beyond their ordinary hours, perhaps. And certainly in the private sector, and I think in the public sector as well, there's legislation about reasonable additional hours. That is, the employer, it's against the law for the employer to ask you to work unreasonable additional hours. And it's also within that law for you to refuse an unreasonable request to work additional hours. And there's, it's not a black and white, nothing simple. It's not a black and white thing about what's reasonable or what isn't. There's the Fair Work Act for private sector employees has about 10 or so criteria that go into determining whether a request for someone to work additional hours is reasonable or not. And that's got to do with things like the employer's considerations. So, you know, what alternatives do they have? Who else could they ask to get? How important is it for the work to be done? Does it have to be done at that time? Can it be done later? Who else is available to do that work? Those sorts of things. And then on the employee side, what are their circumstances? How much notice were they given of this request to work additional hours? What are their family responsibilities? Are they going to get paid overtime or some penalty rate in compensation for working the additional hours and things like that? So, yeah, have a look at those criteria, and
I guess
you've got to have them to hand really, because it's obviously it's going to be a a very quick matter. Their boss says, "Oh, I need you to stay back. You know, you're just about to knock off. Oh, the next shift's not coming in. Need you to stay back." So you've really got to have those criteria to hand and be thinking pretty quickly about whether you want to challenge that request for you to work those additional hours.
My question is like thinking of the Townsville floods. So we're at work, things have changed quite quickly. Staff can't come in, but you know, the safety of my house, the safety of my children. So do I have the right to say, well, no, I'm not staying because I need to safeguard my property and my family? Do I have grounds to leave, but providing care to patients? I guess, you know, it's something that doesn't happen often, but it happened, you know, in the floods in Townsville. So
I think the key to that, sorry, Kev, I think the key to that is the word in those policies where they can ask you or seek you to stay. It talks about reasonable. You know, if you have young children, is it reasonable to leave them in a house that potentially could be subject to flooding? I don't think it is.
it's hard, you know, when both the parents in that household are healthcare workers and there's an expectation for delivery of service, but if neither of us can get back to secure the property. I just was curious as to that definition of reasonable, because it is such a grey zone.
Well, I think in terms of a reasonable thing, that if there's two of you, it might be reasonable for one to stay and the other to go home. You know, and that each situation sort of turns on its own sort of merits, I suppose. Sorry, Kev. I
was just going to say, but in a case where one of our members has made a decision that they are leaving or they're refusing the request to work the additional hours, the best way to avoid any potential repercussions for that is to give the best explanation to your manager that you can as to the reasons why you're refusing their request to work the additional hours. So what you just told me about, you know, the house needs to be secured, children need to be secured, they're good reasons. And if you've got a few more, make sure you tell all of those reasons to your manager. That will minimise the likelihood of that manager wanting to try and you know, sort of punish you somehow later on for making the decision to leave work at that time.
Okay, thanks, Kev. I noticed there was a question from Deb. So Deb works in mental health. It's a requirement to attend patients in their own units over the past 12 months in extreme weather conditions. We've had to go out in heavy rain and flooding to do our duties. Well, in the first, yes, you're asking if they need to provide PPE. Yes, they do. That's a simple response. They're required to provide you with all reasonable, I don't know how you would describe them as PPE, it's personal protective equipment. So in terms of community mental health, Deb, is that people in their own home? Because I would suggest if there's flooding and there is any, and you are required to go through a flooded road to get to them, well, no, I think the answer to that is no, you don't go. That's pretty simple. Because you're placing...
No, they're not roads.
Okay.
It's on a premises.
Okay, so it's a community, a community care unit.
Yes, a community.
Yeah, well, I think if you're required to go outside...
There's no paths, no walkways, and like this year earlier, the rain was so bad. Like it was rain for 5 days nearly. Like everyone was getting saturated shoes, whatever. And I was sort of saying like, okay, you know, I know we're talking about getting to and from work, but we're also talking about safety within a work environment when you've got like flooding and you know, talk of maybe moving patients to a different location, and you know, we've got no umbrellas, no mud boots, no. Nothing, you know, and you couldn't buy anything either at that point.
Well, I think if it's happened before, they need to have a supply of that stuff available for you.
Is that what you're
ready? Yeah, I don't think that's unreasonable at all, and I think you should raise it at your next staff meeting.
Yeah, I
will
will
have raincoats.
tell them I've come to this meeting and like just because also, you know, people have got to come to us for medication and we've got to go to people because they might be supervised or, you know, there's different stages of medication stuff in community care units. And so you have to go out in the rain. If we don't go out, they have to come out. So, you know, I know we tell people to buy umbrellas and raincoats all year round because the heat, the sun, the weather, but it doesn't happen. And, you know, it's really a risk and a safety issue because you can't see where you're going. You know, can you decide on what jobs you can delay? Because, you know, the rain went for 5 days. You just have to do it.
Yeah.
Deb, do you have a health and safety committee at your workplace?
Oh, he's retired. I don't think he's been replaced about 12 months ago.
No, health and safety committee. So that would be multiple people.
Safety officer, like that, you know, the representative for our unit. He's, like I said, he retired 12 months ago, and I don't think it's been filled.
Okay.
Do you have a health and safety committee?
No, not with us. So we don't.
You should. Do you have any health and safety reps?
Well, that's what I said. He's retired.
No, not an officer. So the officer is usually appointed by the employer. I'm talking about a health and safety rep who's elected by you guys, workers, nurses.
Well, I'm probably going to be embarrassed here, but I don't know who they are, if they are, and I've been there 10 years. So I'm not, Patrick used to always do all the health and safety stuff, and since he's left, I don't know what.
That's okay, Deb. So if you've got a health and safety rep, when you go back to work, if you do have one, you might not have one. It might have been that gentleman you're talking to.
Yeah.
But if you do, the employer is obligated to provide the name of the person in that facility who is the health and safety rep, if one exists, and it needs to be on a notice board or somewhere that's reasonably accessible to the employees. That's the Act requires that they have that. Okay. So if you're unable to find it, it's a fair chance that you don't have one. And my suggestion is you have a chat with your organiser, and they can run through that with how we replace that gentleman, so that you can. And I think in the interim, I think you sort of, if you don't have a health and safety committee, I think you raise it in your next staff meeting, so it's on the agenda, because employers are obliged to provide equipment to enable people to perform their role safely. Yeah.
Okay. No worries. Thanks for your time. I will, and that I'll find out who these health and safety people are. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay, so Tammy's got a question. Under the Child Safety Act, you have the responsibility to keep your children safe. Something came up during recent flood events about having the right to secure your property, but after having done so, to return to work if applicable. Okay, well, that's probably a reasonable response. And she's gone on to say, we do community visits too. What about sunscreen in summer? That isn't provided. Well, there's to me, that's another one that your employer, like if you go onto a work site now, you'll notice there's not too many blokes wearing singlets anymore. They're all wearing full sleeve shirts in terms of the sun safe component. So I'd suggest that that's probably a bit safer than sunscreen, but nonetheless, I think, here we go. Queensland Health Supply sunscreen as their gardeners use and issued with it. Yep, okay. So Tammy's got another. Are employees able to take leave to take care of themselves or their family? Natural gas. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Okay, so that, James.
Yeah, I'll leave that with you.
No the only kind of leave that's relevant there is personal leave, which incorporates sick leave and carers leave. And the carers leave component of personal leave includes leave to provide care to a member of the employee's family or household that is ill or injured themselves or is suffering some sort of emergency. So probably if there's an emergency arising from extreme weather, then yes, that would that is affecting a member of your household or family, then yes, someone under the Fair Work Act would be able to take personal leave for that.
Okay. So Tammy's just said this is a quote, and yes, effectively she's confirming what you've said. The quote confirms what you've said, Kevin.
Yeah.
That employers need to keep in mind the well-being of their staff when granting access to leave entitlements, and the leave entitlement is personal leave. Yep.
Yeah,
that's great. Sorry, I didn't read that properly, Tammy. Anyway, all right. Has anybody else got any other questions? All right. Well, oh yes, Kim. Go ahead. Are you able to unmute Kim for us, Colleen? Or am I allowed to do that? I don't know how I do that.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you're unmuted.
Yes. For those who don't know me, I am an organiser with QNMU. I just thought I might mention in the floods earlier this year in the after hours space, some after hours managers made some very unreasonable directions that were then overturned the next day. And an example was staff who said they couldn't get to work because of road flooding were told to go out and take pictures of the flooded roads to provide evidence. I would advise people not to follow that direction. It's unreasonable. We did have it overturned once daylight came and executives were on board, but sometimes after hours managers make panicked advice and decisions that are not reasonable. And if in your professional judgment or in your personal judgment, if you don't believe it's safe, I would say stand your ground and deal with it the next day. Don't put yourself in an unsafe position.
Yeah, clearly directing somebody to go out and take a picture of a flooded road exposes them to other hazards. So yes, good point, Kim. Thank you. All right, well, wonderful. We might pull the pin. I've just noticed that I'm in total darkness here now. I started off with light and it looks a bit creepy. I'm sorry. Anyway, all right. Well, we will send out or Colleen will organise to send out some information in terms of the CPD. And there we go. We're about 2 minutes shy of 7 o'clock. So that's gone well. I want to thank everybody for their attendance, and I hope you have a good evening, and I hope you found this useful. Okay. Thanks, guys. Bye.